This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. You can visit their store by using my referral link in the description below. Hi everyone, I'm Nitsa Hone, and today is Friday, and that means it's time for another MTG Top 10, the series where I rank cards based on their historical performance at Magic's highest level of competition. Today, we're going to look at phasing. A permanent with phasing phases in or out during each of its controller's untap steps. When it is phased out, it's treated as if it doesn't exist. Now, a phased out permanent is not counted as leaving play or entering play like a flicker effect. It's still there. It just can't be interacted with or used in any way. For example, a phased out creature can't attack or block or use its activated abilities, but it also can't be destroyed or targeted with anything. And when it phases back in, it's not like it has summoning sickness, because it was there, it was just treated as if it wasn't. In Magic's early days, phasing was mostly used as a downside, and was put on permanents that would be too powerful if they were always available, like Teferi's Isle, a land that can tap for 2 blue mana, or Teferi's Drake, which had incredibly efficient stats for the time. Making that permanent phase out meant that it could only be used every other turn, so it balanced things. Phasing made its original debut in Mirage, but it was largely retired not long after, in 1997. For the most part, it was a failed mechanic. The way it worked wasn't especially intuitive, and most of the cards they put it on were terrible. However, Wizards of the Coast brought back phasing 20 years later. In 2017. Well, sort of. They printed Teferi's Protection in Commander 2017. Among a bunch of other effects, Teferi's Protection phases out all of your permanents. This isn't exactly phasing, since it isn't an effect the permanent itself has. The permanents you had don't now phase in or out every single upkeep. Instead, they just phase out the one time and then phase back in during your untap step. This wasn't entirely new, as there were some cards in the 90s that caused a permanent to phase out, like Mist Dragon. But this is the kind of effect they chose to bring back instead of bringing back phasing more broadly. Teferi's Protection has of course gone on to be a Commander staple, but it's also a really important card because it was the beginning of Wizards of the Coast regularly using phased out effects, to the point that the mechanic is now considered deciduous. In other words, it shows up on a small number of cards in most sets. Reintroducing phasing this way has been successful, as they found some really interesting ways to use it, resulting in many more powerful and interesting cards with the mechanic than we had in the 90s. Just a few years ago, it would have been impossible to make a phasing top 10, as only 3 cards with it ever top 8'd anything significant. But now that phase out is regularly used, there's more than enough cards for an MTG top 10. To be eligible for this list, a card had to either have phasing or have an effect that causes a permanent or permanents to phase out. In all, there were 63 cards eligible for the video, and in it, we'll look at the 10 that have left the biggest impact on competitive Magic. Before we get started, here's a quick reminder on how I score cards in these videos. A first tier top 8 is worth 2 points, this includes events like Pro Tours, and a second tier top 8 is worth 1 point. This includes events like Grand Prix. Alright, let's get to the list. At number 10, it is Vision Charm. This is one of the old cards that uses phases out. Like most charms, it also has 3 options. In addition to phasing an artifact out, the charm can also mill 4 cards, and it can allow you to change the basic land type of a specific type of lands. As with most charms, especially the really cheap ones, these effects are all pretty minimal, but the modality you have is nice. It was played in extended sideboards in 1998 when it was brought in against high tide decks, where the land changing mode could really hose that deck's ability to produce a bunch of mana. After 25 years of inactivity, earlier this year, Vision Charm has started to see play in Pauper sideboards. It can hate on both artifact decks and monocolor decks pretty effectively, and if you're playing a graveyard deck, you can even get some value out of the mill mode. It actually looks well positioned to gain more points in Pauper in the future. At number 9, it is Ublyt. This enchantment lets you force an opposing creature to phase out as long as it remains in play. At least, that's what it does now. Ublyt has a strange history. Its original printing in Arabian Nights preceded the phasing mechanic, so obviously it didn't utilize it. Instead, it was an extremely wordy card that worked more like an Oblivion Ring, except that when Ublyt left play and the exiled creature was returned, if it had auras on it, it got those back, and the creature also entered tapped. It was only in 2020 with the Double Masters reprint of the card that Wizards of the Coast introduced the new wording of the card, which now utilizes phasing. Obviously enough, Ublyt is a pretty nice removal spell. It sees play in Devotion to Black decks and Pauper, and while it doesn't have any points so far in 2023, that could easily change in the future. At number 8, it is Divine Smite, the first card on the list that is a result of the reintroduction of phasing in the more recent past. Divine Smite allows you to phase out an opposing creature or planeswalker, and if that permanent's black, it exiles it. Obviously, entirely exiling an opposing permanent is way better than phasing it out, but the fact that this still does something against non-black permanents is nice since the upside on the card is amazing. While it was in Standard, it was an occasional sideboard card that was great to bring in against opponents with lots of black permanents. At number 7, it is Spectral Adversary. This 2-mana 2/1 with flying and flash also allows you to pay 1 generic and a blue as many times as you want when it enters the battlefield. For every time you do, it gets a +1/+1 counter and phases out a target artifact, creature, or enchantment. So far the cards we've seen don't use phasing that flexibly, but the Adversary can. You can flash it in to phase out a creature your opponent is targeting with removal, or you can use it to phase out an opposing creature or creatures at the end of your opponent's turn so that they're unable to block on your turn. You can flash it in and use it sort of as a fog effect to phase out all of your opponent's attacking creatures. There's just a lot you can do. And this is especially sweet because the Adversary brings such efficient flying stats to the board at the same time. It's seen play in blue aggro decks in Standard, Pioneer, and Explorer, and it's likely to gain more points in the future. At number 6, it is Frenetic Ifrit. For 25 years, this was by far the best phasing card in the game. And it's no surprise that the Ifrit only uses phase out instead of the full-blown phasing keyword. This 3-mana 2/1 flyer has an activated ability where you flip a coin, and if you win the flip, it phases out. And if you lose the flip, you sacrifice the Ifrit. This was a very aggressive creature back in the 1990s, and its ability made it so your opponent's removal spells failed about half the time. You could even use it to dodge board sweepers. It gained all of its points in 1997 across 3 formats. In Block and Standard it was used in aggro decks, and in Extended it was played as one of the main win conditions in a Jeskai control deck. At number 5, it is Teferi, Master of Time. We saw at the beginning of the video that lots of old phasing cards had Teferi's name in them, so it's only fitting that after they reintroduced the mechanic, he got to have a planeswalker that involved phasing. His -3 ability allows you to phase out a creature you don't control. That wouldn't be the best ability in the world if you could only do it at sorcery speed, but luckily this Teferi can use loyalty abilities at instant speed and even on your opponent's turn. First of all, this means he can actually use a loyalty ability on your turn and then also one on your opponent's turn. In addition to that phasing effect, he also has a +1 that lets you loot and a -10 that gives you extra turns. So when you play him, you can use his +1 on your turn and then his -3 on your opponent's turn to phase out their only creature to protect Teferi. He was played in control decks in Standard, as well as in cycling decks that look to draw and discard a whole bunch of cards. Those decks were pretty interested in Teferi's +1. He hasn't gained any points though since rotating out of Standard. At number 4, it is Guardian of Faith. This is a 3-mana 3/2 with Flash and Vigilance, and when it enters the battlefield you can phase out any number of your other target creatures. While this isn't quite as flexible as Spectral Adversary, it does have a similar design in that it gives you a reasonably efficient flash creature that can blank opposing removal. It can be particularly spicy against board sweepers since you can just phase out everything but the Guardian if you want to. And the fail case is still a 3-mana 3/2 with Vigilance. While it was in Standard, it was a common sideboard in white aggro decks, which could bring it in when they were concerned about sweepers, and it's also a common sideboard card in Pioneer Spirit and white weenie decks. At number 3, it is March of Swirling Mist. This instant allows you to phase out X target creatures. In addition to paying mana for X, you can also exile any number of blue cards from your hand, and for each one you do, it costs 2 less to cast, which means you can phase out 2 more creatures. Like with the Adversary, this is a very flexible way to use phasing. You can use it to save your creatures from all sorts of stuff. You can make it so your opponent can't block your things on your turn. It can also, of course, function as a fog. The March has been played in a variety of blue control decks in Standard. It's the silliest in Hanada decks because you could phase out every single creature on the board for only 1 blue mana if Hanada was in play. Recently, it started to see play in mono blue tempo and toxic decks. It's also played in Lotus Field and Spirit decks in Pioneer. At number 2, it is Slip Out the Back. This 1 blue mana instant puts a +1/+1 counter on a creature and phases it out. While this can be used against an opposing creature, it is much more frequently used on your own creature, since then you can take full advantage of that counter. Now, because of how phasing works, it isn't like this is a combat trick that helps your creature win combat. However, you can use this to protect an important creature, and once it phases back in, it will be even more of a problem for your opponent. This makes it a great inclusion in many blue tempo decks. These decks usually have some instant and sorcery payoffs too, like Tolarian Terror and Haughty Djinn, so the deck gets a ton of value out of running such a cheap spell. It's also played in Spirit aggro decks in Pioneer, and it's going to keep on gaining points, but the number one card on the list has a massive lead, and that card is Kaito Shizuki. This 3-mana Planeswalker packs a ton of power, and part of that is the fact that during your first instep after you play him, he phases out. This is a really neat way to use phasing, as in this case it protects Kaito from being destroyed in any way or being targeted or attacked. This means you basically know that Kaito is going to be able to use at least 2 loyalty abilities before he goes down, including one on the first turn and another on the next turn. And the abilities he has also happen to be great. His +1 lets you loot, unless you've attacked that turn, in which case you just get to draw the card. His -2 makes a 1/1 unblockable ninja, and his ultimate gives you an emblem that lets you search your library for a blue or black creature card and put it on the battlefield anytime one of your creatures does combat damage to your opponent. Obviously, his ability to make an unblockable 1/1 helps fuel both of those other abilities. Kaito is one of the best Planeswalkers in Standard right now, as evidenced by the almost 50 points he has managed to amass in the format in a relatively short period of time. He's a fixture in Esper midrange and control decks, and that's going to continue. He's also gained a few points in Pioneer and has a lot longer in Standard, so he's only going to increase his lead in the future. However, as Wizards of the Coast finds new and powerful ways to utilize phasing, it's entirely possible another challenger could emerge. So those are the top 10 cards with phasing. If you're interested in utilizing this once maligned mechanic, check out the description where you can find a direct Card Kingdom link for each card in the video. If you want to make sure you catch future videos, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications if you want to catch up on past MTG top 10s, including many more that look at keyword abilities and mechanics. You should see some playlists on the screen shortly. Thanks for watching.